I draw for hours and hours almost every day, and I have for a number of years. Originally, it was very complex drawings such as this that I drew using a pencil underdrawing. But more recently, I've been exploring and enjoying drawing freehand directly in ink. And there's something that I've begun to do very recently that I didn't even intend to start doing, which has made a huge improvement, I think, to my freehand pen accuracy. And I'm going to outline 5 reasons why doing this can hugely improve our drawings. But first, let me show you examples of this recent addition to my freehand drawing process that I've discovered. And I discovered it accidentally making a video on drawing this window. And what happened was I drew the window, but I messed up this right hand side. The order in which I drew these elements above this top framing weren't done in an order that made keeping things symmetrical as easily as possible. And so I messed up the symmetry. And because it's a very important part of this scene, I thought I had to draw this again. And this is my second attempt at drawing this window. And of course, what happened was when I drew this section, I was very alert to what hadn't quite worked out. And I paid more attention to the way in which I drew my lines here, the order in which I drew them, and made sure I both established symmetry and also kept both these ends attached to the rest of the window in a better place. A few drawings later, I was drawing this Scottish castle for another video, and I wasn't 100% sure how I was going to do this stonework. I've drawn stonework before, but it can be tricky, and it can be tricky to get the scale right. And so what I did was I just grabbed the nearest offcut of paper and experimented a little bit with how I was going to render the wall. And I quite liked the effect I was getting, but I thought I needed to minimize things like those lines there. But for the sake of 3 minutes drawing this, when I drew my castle, I was already with both the rendering technique I was going to use and the scale I wanted to concentrate on to capture the effect of the stone. And a short while later, I was drawing the first battleship that I've drawn since I was about 15. And while I can't actually locate my reference photo for this drawing, you can see that there's quite a challenging curve here. And these curves, describing the shape of the hull from this perspective, I thought were going to be the most challenging part of the drawing. And again, I grabbed a scrap of paper and I just did a quick practice. And then I compared this with my reference before I committed in my drawing. And I think this might have been the first one for this Berlin Bridge, where I actually used the same scrap of paper. I'd rehearsed the hull of the USS Missouri. That just helped me get a stronger sense of getting these proportions correct before I drew my demonstration drawing for the video. When I was drawing the Tower of London, I wasn't worried about the stonework because I still remembered how I did the Scottish castle. But I was more concerned about the roofs of these towers because while they can look quite simple, they're actually, from a shape point of view, quite complicated with their convex and concave shapes. And so I practiced, and my first practice was, well, it made me glad I was doing a practice. And my second practice was only marginally better, but I also practiced this one and just had a sense of how I was going to do the windows. And while I don't think this is my best drawing, it's certainly a whole lot better than it would have been if I hadn't had to go just to work out the best approach for my line work. But from that point, I began to see the benefit of doing some line work before we start our drawing. I don't mean warm-up exercises where we're just getting our hand warmed up for shapes and holding the pen, but I mean actual things that are derived from our drawing. For this London church, I was really concerned at getting these proportions correct because particularly this section is relatively high, I think, proportionally compared to the rest. And so I had a quick rough out that did serve the purpose of warming up my hand, but it also let me get a sense of, okay, this still isn't actually quite high enough. So I really have to, when I get to this section, push it a little bit higher. And when I came to draw the church, I think I was much better equipped to actually both pay a greater attention to the proportions here and to push my hand to just draw these horizontal lines a little bit higher than I would have. When I drew this French fort, I hadn't really worked out whether my hatching for tone was going to work best horizontally coming across or vertically coming down. Plus again, I had the challenge of working out how to do this stonework. I also find flags can be a bit of a challenge, and so a quick dress rehearsal drawing where I focused on the proportions of this cylinder, or this drum, where I just drew a few quick hatching lines vertically and horizontally to see which effect I felt was going to work better. And I had a chance to practice not just the flag, but the way I would hatch to render the red and the blue. All of which I think directly benefited my drawing, which I did, of course, straight after. When I drew, I think the only, if you like, still life that I've drawn so far, I wasn't really concerned with this frieze, but I was concerned with these lines. And so doing a quick dress rehearsal bowl let me experiment with how my arm had to move and how it felt to get the curve that I actually wanted. And it also gave me practice in these curves at the top. And again, I also hadn't worked out with my hatching for the colour of the lower half of the bowl, whether I was going to go across or whether I was going to come down this way and reflect the curvature of the bowl more. But with a quick experimentation, I thought this worked well, and it was certainly going to be a much easier method. And I put all of this into practice when I actually drew my bowl then. I knew this was going to be a challenging drawing to do freehand directly in ink. And so I didn't need any encouragement to do, if you like, a draft experimentation, because I knew getting these curves in the right place, particularly given that the very top of the doorway was cut off in my original reference, was going to be tricky. And it let me see that my natural tendency would be to not bring these curves round far enough. And it also helped me work out exactly which of these lines finished up curving together into one line and which ones didn't. And again, 5 minutes later, after playing around with this, I was able to draw a much more credible doorway without getting lost in the tangle of possibilities than I would have if I hadn't spent 5 minutes on my quick draft drawing. This derelict lighthouse was one of the first ones where I did a bit of a draft experiment. And it was particularly because I was wondering how I was going to render these weathered bricks. And while that didn't prove to be a problem when I played around with what technique I would use, what I did discover was that it was easier to misplace the support for the light on top. And what that meant was when I actually drew this, besides the fact I knew that my rendering would work for the weathered bricks, I was able to pay a lot more attention with how I positioned this metal support for the light on top of the tower. This most recent drawing I've done was how we render these Paris street paving stones. And it really was a practice in just exactly what angles do I need to get to represent these bands of pavers accurately. And then there was a little bit of just playing around with the figures. And I didn't even use one sheet of paper. I actually drew it across 2 scraps of paper that just happened to be here. But that certainly didn't matter. And it did mean that I think I did do a better drawing when I went straight from here to here. Now this is a drawing that I didn't do at home, and I didn't bother with a draft drawing. And it's a drawing where my proportions, I think, for this shape and this shape and this shape are less accurate than they usually are. And while it's not really noticeable if we just see the drawing, I do aim to get proportions as accurate as I can. And this box is simply too high, and this side doesn't go back far enough. And I suspect the angle also, oh look at that angle, it's also not right. What I should have done was a quick drafting of the proportions of these walls and of the perspective angles. when I drew this scene, because I've drawn it before, I also didn't bother doing a little 5-minute sketch first. And what I did was I increased the gap between these columns just slightly. And that meant that the overall width from this angle of the arc du carousel is wider. And that gives the feeling that instead of moving away from us in a straight line, that it's sort of swinging towards us a little bit. Almost as if this is not a rectangle, but it's a bit more of a wedge shape with this side coming out to us. And I know that if I'd done a quick warm-up sketch of this would have been the area I paid most attention to. This would have been the part I'd have been focusing on. The other thing I got wrong was this angle of the top of the columns. This is the angle it should be, and as you can see, my angle is like this. And that also has the effect of making this wall look as though it's coming out towards us more. So while this is still a nice drawing, there are a couple of errors in it which I think a 5-minute warm-up draft sketch would have helped me not to make. So why are these drafting drawings, as I think of them, so helpful? Why do I believe they improve my drawing so much? I think there are 5 reasons. The first is that while they're not traditional warm-up exercises for drawing, they do serve as a warming up activity. So we're engaging our eye-hand coordination. We're getting used to moving our pen on the paper and to feeling the marks it makes. We're getting used to seeing something in our reference and trying to create the effect with marks. We're experimenting with different marks. Have you ever noticed that often the last lines we end up doing in a drawing are the best lines? They're nice and relaxed and they have life and movement and they go where we want them to be. Well, that's basically because we've taken the whole drawing to warm up. And unfortunately, often the very first lines we draw are fairly central lines to the overall drawing. And often they're our stiffer, more wooden looking lines that aren't necessarily as accurately placed as well. So the fact that this drafting activity gives us a chance to warm up is still a very useful thing. I think the second reason, and this is really important, is that it significantly increases our observation of our reference. I still believe that most of the errors that we make in our drawing are not because we can't control our lines, but because we haven't observed carefully enough exactly where they're meant to go in relation to the other lines we've already drawn. And when I do my drafting activity, I'm starting to engage in observation with my reference. And I'm doing it to a degree that I think is adequate to do a rough drawing that's in proportion and with angles being correct. And when I go to do my actual drawing, if you like, I'm standing on top of the shoulders of all of that observation. I'm further along, I'm higher up in observation because I've already been engaged in a way that has both started to make me very familiar with the reference and has actually highlighted some areas that I'm now aware I need to pay more careful attention to before I start to draw. So these drawings before we draw are a great benefit in increased observation. The third point, which I have found very significant, is that they're a dress rehearsal for the actual lines. If you like, we're engaging in movement that will activate muscle memory, so that when I go to draw this curve now, my arm, my hand, my shoulder have had a practice at how they need to all work together to get the line that I want. I've already drawn the perspective angles, or the most difficult ones. And so now I've got a feeling that to get the angle as steep as I need to get it, to have it accurate, I need to position, hold myself, be thinking in whatever way I need to get that line. But I've practiced the physicality of drawing that line in the right place, of maneuvering my body in the right place in relation to the paper even, to draw that line as well as I can. And so there should be an increased accuracy in curves, in angles, and so forth. The fourth area I think they help our drawing, which I certainly highlighted in that look through a number of my drafting activity drawings, is that they give us a chance to experiment with texture, to work out which directions will I do my hatch lines. How will I render leaves or grass or stone? Not just how will I render it, but to check the scale, the size of the marks I want to make. in proportion to the overall size of the object. I think this is a particularly useful area for this sort of drafting drawing. And my fifth and final way I think that these drawings help our drawing is that it gives us a chance to juggle with proportion. Again, to draw what we think is right, but to put us in a position then to be able to say to ourselves, yes, well, I thought this was right, but I can see that this isn't actually tall enough. Or this rectangle is too squarish. I need to make sure I change the proportions either in the height or the width if I want it to align more with my reference. So it gives a chance to start to see which proportions may just cause me trouble when I go to do my actual drawing. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this helpful. If you're like me, you're going to be thinking, yeah, that's I can see that, but really I just need to start. I just need to start my drawing. Can I suggest you take a few drawings where you do one of these drafting drawings first and just see if it doesn't help you develop a level of accuracy and of more appropriate line work that you haven't had before, particularly in your freehand drawing. I know it has certainly helped me in all of these respects. But look, whatever you draw and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.